The armed forces of Ukraine crushed the elite Russian army unit Oplot near Pokrovsk. Due to critical, irreversible losses, the Russian command was forced to withdraw the remnants of the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade from the combat zone. A crushing blow was dealt to the enemy by the soldiers of the 79th Air Assault Brigade. They remember their opponent well from as far back as 2014. Back then, Ukrainian paratroopers faced this unit during the defense of the Donetsk airport.
And 154 combat engagements were recorded by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on the front over the past day. The most tense situation remains in the Pokrovsk direction. There, the enemy attacked the defense forces' positions 35 times and 21 times in the Kostiantynivka direction. Another 20 attacks were recorded on the Huliaipol section of the front. 13 times the Russians tried to break through the defenses on the Sloviansk bridgehead.
Well, and the defense forces of Ukraine prevented a large-scale offensive by the Russian army. This was stated by President Volodymyr Zelensky in an interview with CNN. The head of state emphasized that the success of the operation was largely made possible by drone technologies. Manpower losses in the Russian army reached 30 to 35,000 soldiers per month, thanks to the use of FPV and other types of drones.
Moscow prepared a large-scale offensive operation. They wanted to start it at the end of last year and continue this spring. In response, we carried out our own counter-offensive actions to disrupt the plans for the Russian offensive. Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, in an interview with CNN.
We will talk about these and other news from the front with our guest. Spokesman for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, Serhiy Bratchuk, joins our broadcast. Serhiy, good morning and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes, glory to the defense forces. Greetings, colleagues.
Good morning.
There are currently separate reports now that, in fact, be that as it may, the occupiers are preparing for some kind of large-scale offensive. This is sometimes called the beginning of the spring-summer campaign. But judging by what the General Staff of Ukraine says, I haven't seen any significant changes on the front right now in terms of how many occupiers and Russians have been eliminated by the defense forces of Ukraine or how much equipment. Again, we see how actively vehicles are being destroyed. This, in turn, I think everyone understands, is about logistics, about the delivery of manpower, ammunition, provisions, and everything. Yes, that is needed to supply the army. Overall, how would you assess what is happening right now? Well, basically, the attacks remain quite active, dozens in the most active directions every day. So what kind of attacks are these? I understand that this tactic of small assault groups remains the most popular one for the occupiers right now. And that's where these losses come from.
Well, actually, if we're talking about changes on the front and the general situation that has developed from the Severoslobozansky to the Pridneprovsky directions of the front, indeed, today, two sectors of the front remain the most active. The eastern one, Donetsk, let's call it that, and the Zaporizhzhia one. As of today, it's obvious that the Russians haven't stopped, however paradoxical that might sound to some, their offensive actions, because they're trying to completely occupy the settlements of Raishin and Radinsky. This is, if we're talking about the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration, because it's really about logistics, an attempt to create or continue creating that very bridgehead to then move further into the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. Therefore, activity in the Kostiantynivka direction, the Lyman direction, and the Pokrovsk direction remains. In other words, the enemy's offensive actions haven't actually stopped. We're saying the same thing today, for example, about the Russians' attempts to counterattack and advance in the Kupiansk direction. Today, the focus may have shifted slightly. Not the city of Kupiansk itself, although the Russians, of course, will continue to try, well, at least to regain some of their positions there because, well, I probably can't even remember how many times now the Russians have occupied Kupiansk. And it's clear that this taking of the settlement on credit, they have to pay it off somehow. And accordingly, we're talking about the Zaporizhzhia front. Regarding Huliaipol, the direction of the enemy's offensive actions here hasn't changed. The task hasn't changed either, to completely occupy Huliaipol in the near future in order to, again, create bridgeheads for further actions along the Zaporizhzhia front. However, why do I speak of a certain paradox in the situation? Because today it's obvious that on that same Zaporizhzhia front, the Russian 5th Combined Arms Army, which is the main striking force in this direction, is suffering losses and losing its combat effectiveness. Some units are being forced to withdraw for complete replenishment. Accordingly, reserves are also being brought in. So the offensive nature of the Russian actions remains. However, there's the Oleksandrivka direction of the front, and we know that it's precisely here that the counterattacking actions of the defense forces managed to truly thwart the enemy's plans for this period. Moreover, today the Russians are carrying out actions that, according to their design and plan, they should have carried out, well, probably about 3 months ago. So it's clear that these plans not only need to be adjusted, they have actually been thwarted as of today. Moreover, let's say at the junction of two advancing Russian armies, the 36th and the 5th, which I already mentioned, today, accordingly, on the left flank of the 36th and the right of the 5th Army, the counter-attacking actions of the defense forces continue today. And it's clear that the situation here for the Russians leaves much to be desired. I'm trying to put it mildly, without getting ahead of myself regarding some problems of the Russian army. And it's obvious that while they're on this offensive, the armed forces of Ukraine are breathing down their necks. And it's quite clear that the turn of events could be, well, very unpleasant for the Russian army, and it points to a certain paradox. They seem to be advancing, yet they're taking losses and losing ground on other parts of the front. Actually, the president mentioned this when he said that in our southern territories, we are liberating our lands. And so, as you can see, we're thwarting the enemy's plans.
Tell me, Serhiy, what role does the casualty rate of the Russian Federation's army play in these thwarted enemy plans? In that same CNN interview, the Ukrainian head of state noted that the number of dead, or, code 200s or 300s from the Russian Federation's army is reaching up to 45,000. And so the question arises, what must the Russian army, Putin personally, and the Kremlin do to, first of all, replace these losses? And how, in your opinion, will they try to do that in the foreseeable future?
Well, actually, today we see that on some days these questions are often asked, including by our viewers. The enemy's losses are 780, or a bit over 800 personnel. However, we're talking about a high percentage of code 200 specifically, because not all the wounded make it to hospitals since logistics are disrupted. And you already mentioned, thank you, that point about the enemy's motor vehicles being destroyed. That's also connected to the evacuation of those taking losses, those units. Consequently, the number of fatalities is increasing. As a result, we see days when it's over 1,000. On average, it adds up to at least 30,000 a month now. The question is absolutely right, not rhetorical. How will they replace these losses? Today, it's clear that Russia is forced to use operational tactical reserves, specifically in the Huliaipol direction. I mentioned that for a reason. And these losses, again, are coming from the reserves. I want to emphasize again, they need to restore the reserve and replenish units and formations. Today, this is a major problem for the Russian army. That is, the question of full mobilization is becoming increasingly acute. The Russians talk about it a lot in the media, but it's clear they're afraid to take such actions today. Although the legal grounds for this in Russia were established long ago, and again, we're talking about the creation of kill zones. The range and area of these kill zones will obviously increase along the front line on both sides. Therefore, it's becoming harder and harder for the Russians to move.